king had fled from Seoul. The court was making the arduous trek to Pyongyang. Half of Korea was already in Japanese hands. Yi-il, the very same man who had once tried to pass his negligence off to Yi Sun-shin, was the commander of the Korean army. His forces were routed in battle after battle. Essential fortifications and choke points were abandoned, surrendered with barely a fight. Then, in the Battle of Chungju, the regular Korean forces, under the command of a man named Shin-rip, were annihilated. This is the moment that forces the king to abandon his capital. This is the moment that leads many to fear that Korea as a nation may not survive. But on the very same day that the king fled from his seat, Admiral Yi was destroying the Japanese fleet in Okpo harbor. Hope for the nation lived in a handful of ships plying the coast. For 3 weeks after Okpo, Yi gathered charts, scouted out the enemy fleet, and waited for his secret weapon, the turtle ship, to arrive. Then his spies reported to him that the Japanese were anchored at Sacheon. This was too near his personal headquarters for comfort, so it was time he tested out the turtle ship. It was time he drove them off. But when his tiny fleet of 26 ships arrived outside Sacheon, he saw that the Japanese arquebusiers had taken up positions along the cliffs above the harbor. If he were to attack, they could pour down fire on his ships. He pondered this for a moment. Then he sent a small detachment to sail within sight of the Japanese fleet. Once they were sure the Japanese had spotted them, they turned and fled, and the Japanese gave chase. But the retreat was feigned. As soon as the Japanese fleet entered open water, Yi fell upon them with his entire force. His turtle ship plowed into the middle of the Japanese armada. Cannon fire rang out from all sides. Ships splintered and burned in the setting sun. The Japanese tried to close in, but they couldn't manage to board the covered turtle ship. With the Korean warships surrounding them and the turtle ship in their midst, the Japanese fought a hopeless battle until all 13 of the ships that had pursued the Koreans to open water were at the bottom of the sea. Not a single Korean vessel was lost. After the battle, as his commanders gathered for a debriefing, Yi loosed his coat, pulled out a sword, and dug out a bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. His sub-commanders were amazed. To maintain morale, Yi had let no one know that he'd been injured in the fight. But as they all sat dumbfounded, Yi simply began to brief them on what to do in case of a counterattack. The next day, local fishermen reported to Yi that the Japanese were anchored at Angolpo, and that their men were sacking the city. Yi ordered his fleet to move with all haste. He would not let another Japanese slaughter go unanswered. When they reached the harbor city of Angolpo, he once again smashed through the enemy line with his turtle ship, positioned it right next to the enemy flagship, and buried shot after shot in its side. With his turtle ship in their midst, the enemy couldn't maneuver, and because the turtle ship had heavy guns on all sides, it couldn't be flanked. It simply loosed salvo after salvo at everything around it. And while the turtle ship caused chaos, the rest of the Korean ships surrounded the Japanese and trapped them in the harbor. At the height of the battle, one of Yi Sun-shin's sub-commanders, Kwon-jun, stood upon the deck of his vessel, drew his bow, and loosed an arrow at the enemy admiral. The shot found its mark. 2 of his men then leapt upon the enemy flagship and cut off the Japanese admiral's head. Seeing their commander's head held aloft, the Japanese were thrown into a panic. Command broke down, and in the chaos, Yi's ships sank the Japanese vessels one by one. As night fell and the Koreans withdrew, not a single Japanese ship remained. 2 days later, another Korean fleet, a fleet that was supposed to have joined them before any of this began but ran behind, finally rendezvoused with Yi, bringing his squadron up to 51 ships in total. With this larger force, he began to chase down rumors of another anchored Japanese fleet sacking a Korean town. The rumor turned out to be true, and again, Yi pounced upon the Japanese while they were disorganized, plundering a town. Again, Yi sent his turtle ship into their midst, and again, he used a feigned retreat to lure them out into open water, although this time he did it to keep the Japanese from fleeing to shore if they were defeated. Again they followed, and again, upon his signal, his fleet turned upon their pursuers. Again the Japanese admiral fell in the battle, and Japanese morale broke. Again, the Koreans trapped the fleeing vessels, and again, the Japanese fleet, 26 ships in all, was destroyed, without a single loss for Yi's forces. Turtle ship was OP. Upon hearing of all this, Hideyoshi was furious. He was so close to conquering Korea. His men had taken Pyongyang. The Korean court had been driven all the way to a tiny border village. Any further and the King of Korea wouldn't even be on Korean soil anymore. There was only one province he had not yet been able to overrun, Jeolla, where Yi was based. And without control of the sea, he couldn't resupply his massive army in the field. Yi must be destroyed. The order was given. There would be no more land raids from his navy until Yi's fleet was at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. He ordered his admirals to pool their forces and to form a massive fleet to sweep aside this admiral that was causing him so much pain. The three main Japanese admirals were to gather their fleets in Busan, but the admiral with the largest fleet, Wakisaka Yasaharu, decided that bringing the fleets together was taking too long. Side note, if you watched our Sengoku Jidai series, this is one of the men who would eventually betray Ishida at the Battle of Sekigahara. Anyway, eager for glory and unwilling to wait for the rest of the Japanese forces, he set out with his 73 ships. I mean, why wait? He had 73 of the best ships in the Japanese fleet, and he knew Yi's armada, however devastating they might have been so far, was a small force. But Yi hadn't been idle after his last battle. He'd been drilling his men in new tactics and constructing additional ships. With these new additions, his fleet now numbered 56, and most importantly, with 2 new turtle ships he could bring to bear. On July 7, 1592, a local farmer came to tell Yi that he had seen a huge Japanese armada, at least 70 ships strong, in the Gyeonnaeryang Strait. Yi had his fleet there by the next day. Knowing that he couldn't maneuver in the strait, Yi sent out 6 of his ships to lure the Japanese, and sure enough, the entire Japanese force followed at all haste. But this time, the Japanese faced yet another surprise. This technique of luring out the Japanese had been working so well that Yi had trained his men in a special formation called the Crane's Wing, where they would form a U around the enemy vessels that chased his ships, compressing them from all sides, making them easy targets, and leaving them no room to maneuver. The Crane's Wing descended. The sound of cannon fire ripped the air. One of the largest naval battles in world history raged for hours. But when the smoke cleared, 47 of the Japanese ships were sunk and 12 were captured. Only 14 of them escaped to the harbor at Busan, and still, not a single Korean ship was lost. The next day, Yi was informed of the location of the other 2 admirals' fleets. They were anchored together at Angolpo. Yi saw the opportunity for a decisive blow, and so he set his vessels fresh off the last battle towards another attack. This time, though, no matter what he tried, the Japanese refused to be lured out of their position, so Yi sent his ships in small assault squads, using their superior range to hammer the largest of the Japanese ships, then moving clear so another squad could circle in and fire. The battle was long and bloody. Though still none of Yi's ships were sunk, between the action outside of Gyeonnaeryang and the Battle of Angolpo, hundreds of his sailors were wounded. It was the most damage the Japanese had done to Yi's fleet to date. But the majority of the Japanese fleet in the harbor was destroyed. Only a few ships remained, and these Yi ordered not to be touched, because many of the Japanese soldiers had fled to the nearby shore, and, as he said, many brigands escaped into the mountains where local inhabitants have taken refuge. If all the Japanese ships were to be burned, the brigands would massacre Korean citizens in revenge. As he expected, instead of slaughtering the peasants in the hills, the Japanese boarded their remaining boats and slipped away in the night. 6 days later, upon hearing the news of these calamitous defeats, Hideyoshi ordered all offensive naval operations to cease. From now on, the Japanese Navy would only guard the passage to Busan. And so, with one stroke, Yi destroyed all of Hideyoshi's hopes for invading China. And without being able to resupply from the sea, even the Japanese efforts on the Korean peninsula were in jeopardy. The supply lines to the forces occupying Pyongyang were sorely stretched, and pursuing the Korean court any further became effectively impossible. Though the Korean army had been beaten on land time and time again, Yi had saved Korea. But the war wasn't over. Join us next time for Yi's attempt to land a finishing blow, treachery, and perhaps the greatest last stand in naval history.